Hi, this is JC from Mindfulness Matters. So today I thought we'd talk a little bit about something called cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are something that we all have. It doesn't matter how sharp or smart you are. The minute you leave a place of contentment in your mind and you start to encounter some kind of distress, fear, anxiety, an emotional state that's not pleasant, and even sometimes highly pleasant emotional states, you will end up having cognitive distortions. Now, it sounds like a big phrase, but the truth is, if you break down the words, it's pretty simple to understand. In process, it's thinking wrongly. Sometimes you hear it called stinking thinking, but cognitive just means thinking, and distortions, well, that's pretty simple. It means it's not accurate. And so one of the things I do is very beginning work with people is I give them a list of cognitive distortions and ask them to memorize them. And if you don't memorize them, you aren't going to be aware as much as when you're thinking in a distorted way. Having cognitive distortions is actually the opposite of mindful thinking, right? So I'm going to review some of the most common cognitive distortions that we encounter. Now, my list is kind of a top 10, but the truth is if you go online, you will find more resources than you can gather. Go ahead and look these up. Please pay attention to them. It's an easy way to correct some of the things you're doing that are causing you trouble in your mind. So number one on my list is called all or nothing thinking. So that's also black and white thinking. All or nothing thinking is when you tend to swing from one end of the pendulum to the other. Does someone always do something? Do they never do something? Do you always do something or never? The truth is, always and never are not likely to be. Isn't that true? So think about where are the times in your life where you might be having these extreme ways of thinking. If you're upset with someone who's hurt you, you could say, well, they always disappoint me. So if in exploring things that you're thinking through facts and evidence mindfully, like I've talked about earlier, doesn't produce evidence about that, then you have to look at what's going on that you need to change. When we have black and white thinking, we are not flexible at all. It's an important one to catch. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So next we look at overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is when you take something that has happened at one time or in maybe a scenario or two and you make it true across all spectrums. Where I see this most is people looking at medications, for example. So if you try a medicine and that medicine doesn't work, you might come back in and say, no medicines work for me. Well, that might not be true. Maybe it's just that medicine doesn't work. Or all girls are crazy or all men are unemotional. Nope, that's kind of a black and white thinking used in an overgeneralization sense. And so one experience that doesn't go well does not mean that every experience you have after that won't go well. Please be aware of that. Number 3 is called mental filter. This one's really, really important. And so here's a great example to remember what mental filter is. Have you ever been sitting around with a group of friends or maybe your siblings and talking about something you've been through in your past, and each of you that were there in that space and time during the event has a completely different recollection of how it went, but you all know that you were there? That is evidence that mental filter is taking place. So a mental filter happens when in the event and when something's happening, you're paying attention to this particular scenario or a particular outcome. If you have a vacation and it rains on the most important day that you had something planned, you might come home and say your vacation was a bust because it rained. Well, that is true, but are there other truths to that? And so what a mental filter does is it gets us thinking about just that one thing that we've held important. And unfortunately, maybe it's not the most important thing. Now, long-term, where this is a problem is that the mental filter will, in time, be the only thing that you remember. And so that's very, very important. It's why your childhood memories are different to your siblings, is that you don't remember those things because you kept focusing on the one thing that was important. So your brain only keeps what it thinks is necessary. This is where we get into trouble if we aren't paying really good attention to what we're remembering. Consider all things. Keep your eyes open, and when you're going through a difficult time, look for the good things as well as the bad things. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about that right now with our coronavirus quarantine. They're talking about silver linings and what's something good that's happened, and I've heard a lot of great stories about that. So next is called disqualifying the positive. So this one's kind of black and white, right? Disqualifying the positive is when you look at something and you find a way for it not to count. If you did well on a test or you performed well in an area and someone says, wow, you did really good, you would have said, well, it was easy and that's why. And so if somebody does something good and we're upset with them about something else they've done, we're going to shut down that positive. Again, this is where being mindful is important, because we are teaching ourselves to have balanced thinking that's clear, and it's based on exploration of facts and evidence, kind of like scales. So when we disqualify the positive, we don't give ourselves an opportunity to look at what might be out there. This is kind of also something I've called the what else of mindfulness, is that if you don't like the way you see it, spin it around. There's more than one way to see something, and it might help you get through. So next is an A and B. I love this one. So our large one is called jumping to conclusions. And so when we look at jumping to conclusions, this is literally jumping to conclusions. We've gone ahead to the end result before we have information that leads us to the end result. There's two ways we can jump to conclusions. One is called the fortune teller error. This is important because what we've done is we've predicted how something will go to get to that conclusion that might be inaccurate. Do not predict. Unless you have good facts and evidence, do not be a fortune teller and fall into that error. The second one is called the mind reading. And so the mind reading error is when we believe we know what another person is thinking or feeling. And again, our conclusion is to act in that way that we've concluded without knowing for sure. So if you think someone's mad at you, what's the best way to find out? Is to look at that person and say, are you angry with me? And if they say yes, well, then you haven't jumped to conclusions. You've made a good assessment. So this is something that's important to figure out. I would encourage you to identify what you're thinking about. I can't tell you how many times that I've said, think about what you're thinking about. And so when we do that, we put ourselves in successful positions because we're more clear about our thoughts. So looking at number 6 on our list, we have something called magnifying. And sometimes we look at the extremes of that. So it could be magnifying, which is catastrophizing, or also minimizing, which is also problematic. Do not blow something up, even if your emotions are telling you to do that. I know sometimes in my personal life, I'll be upset about something and I'll realize I'm way more upset than I should be about this. What's going on here? And that's a wonderful time to explore. Is this some kind of trigger for me? Am I sensitive to this? Did I just not sleep? Am I hangry? Do I need a Snickers bar? What is it that's going on that I'm magnifying or also minimizing? Am I making something small that actually needs to have more attention? So be really mindful of those. Number 7 is the most important one of all of them, in my opinion. It's called emotional reasoning. It is the absolute absence of mindfulness. Emotional reasoning is very simple. It says, I think it, therefore it's true. And I want you to realize that those things, those conclusions, can get us in very, very big trouble. We've not investigated. We've not thought things through. We've not looked at alternatives. We've not investigated to see is actually everything that I'm thinking and feeling right now based on facts and evidence. I obviously have worked with the mental health population for years, and one of the sad things I see is that when someone completes the act of suicide, what I'm pretty sure of is that at some point they've concluded they have felt like they would be better off dead, and to them that became true. They didn't investigate it. And so emotional reasoning is really, really important to catch. Please catch when you're taking your feelings and you're making them truths without investigation. It's unhealthy, and in extremes it's dangerous. And that's kind of the thing about cognitive distortions. The more profound they become, the more confused you are. The more distorted you become, the less aware your brain is because of changes in your thinking processes and what part of the brain is being used. So not only are you less likely to notice, but you're going to be less likely to be able to solve the problem when you're highly distorted. One of my rules is that if I'm upset, my job is to be quiet. I have to wait until I'm back to a more baseline state. If I'm distorted, I'm not thinking clearly. If I'm not thinking clearly, what am I trying to solve right now? Do I need to just wait a little bit until I'm thinking more clearly? So be good to yourselves when you think about that. Number 8 is pretty simple. It's called should statements. When we should ourselves or others, it's important to understand that what you do there is you create inflexibility. Now, are there some things that are pretty hard to avoid? If you've got trauma in your childhood, say from a mother or a father, you might be thinking, well, a good parent should, right? Or a good citizen should. And it's not to say that those aren't reasonable things to conclude, but if that doesn't happen in your life, it makes alternative thinking or having to make accommodations more difficult. So be aware of what you think should be, but then also be aware of what the reality is in your scenario in your life and how likely it is that that might actually play out. And that just helps you get to a different conclusion or just to get to acceptance a little bit sooner. So number 9 is labeling and mislabeling. This we see in the larger society. Be very careful what you label. If you've put a label on something, do you have the information you need to label that? And is it accurately labeled? Have you mislabeled something, and how long have you done that for? And so when we're making conclusions about people, places, or things, it's important for us to identify, is my judgment on this, my label on this, is it accurate? Is it helpful to me to think this? Will it serve me or benefit me in any way? And those are some mindful questions you can ask about that. And then last, number 10 is personalization. This is when we think we're responsible for everything. Now, sometimes you are responsible for things, and I get that, and it's okay. But if you're one of those I'm sorry people, and I might be one of those people, if you say I'm sorry a lot, sometimes we just are saying sorry because we're just sorry somebody's going through something. But if you're one of those people who says I'm sorry and you tend to take responsibility for everything that goes wrong, be mindful of that. Why it's a problem is that you're violating good boundaries. Not everything is your fault. Not everything happens because of you. And sometimes we can personalize at other people, right? So think about how important that is. Now, I ran through this list really, really quickly. This is my top 10. They all could be unpacked. I've spent hours teaching this, and I could go an hour on this list of 10, but I wanted to share this 10 with you. Again, if you go online and you Google anywhere, cognitive distortions, you will find a really great list. Many of them are public domain, and it's something for you to look at. When you're not doing well, go to the list. I encourage people all the time. I know in my own personal walk, at one time, this was on my fridge, kind of needed to be. So be good to yourself. Remember that you have the opportunity to change at every thought. Every thought you have the opportunity to change. And remember also, mindfulness matters. Think about it.